Welcome to the World Builders Anvil, episode 137. Today's topic, patterns of evolution.
Ooh.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builders Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build.
Welcome back. As always, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I am not Michael Miller.
And she is not Michael Miller. That is Kristin Ingram, my lovely wife and willing substitute co-host all the time.
I figure if we record one show a week, we might as well do two.
Might as well do two. That's right. And Mike today...
Michael
and Mike, neither one can make it today. And Michael was actually on the way in, and orcs invaded Connecticut. So he is actually off doing battle against orcs, valiantly saving us from the evils of their invasion.
AKA construction traffic.
We think it's construction. He never reached or saw what was causing it, but really, really bad traffic.
Wow.
Yeah. So Michael will be here next week, and we will roll on with the episode as usual. And now for the patterns of evolution. When I talk about evolution in my world, it's something I talk about a lot, but I realized I never really explained what I do with it. I just say, and then you evolve it. Ding! You know, and that could mean lots of different things. First easy one would be like biological evolution. I do not do true biological evolution. That would be utterly way too complicated. Except the thing I know from it is typically as species reach the point of extinction, the likelihood that new traits pop up is common. And if they get isolated into a new area, the likelihood that they change is likely. So I use those when I spread creatures about my world, but I don't really go heavily into the actual
evolutionary
process outside of I'm just going to decide at this point that the ones here are different than the ones there, and this is why, because they were almost extinct, or they got separated because some floated out to an island off the coast and evolved slightly different than the ones on the coast. So,
well, and I think you do that to some degree with the orcs in your world. Like the mountain orcs have evolved, differently than the rest of them.
Races and creatures evolve. And you see less differences in races because they're sentient, so they can use their brain to overcome some of the obstacles. But once they get to that point, still, if there's a long period of time that they're separated, there's a greater likelihood that there's a difference.
And gibberlings never evolve.
Gibberlings are actually considered a magical race, so they never evolve.
So is there less evolution with your magical races than with your non-magical races?
There is no evolution with my magical races.
Interesting.
The magic is the evolution.
Okay.
So a very quick thing on species evolution. I do kind of do it, but it's really more of I stick my finger up in the air and I feel the direction I want the wind to go with it, and I take it that way. It would be way too complicated and way too burdensome to actually evolve from single-cell organisms to every species on your planet.
Yeah, that seems like a bit much.
Yeah. So normally when I talk about evolution, I'm not talking about biological evolution. I'm talking about either cultural or technological evolution. And in that, I evolved magic the same way as technology. And originally when I developed Garduin for a really long period of time, as magic grew, technology weakened, and as technology grew, magic weakened. So over the normal course of events, magic sort of went away. And there are some things that limit magic, which I'm not going to go in here too much. But essentially, magic is a fundamental fabric of the universe. It's a way of tapping into it. So when I redid the rules for Gardul, I actually decided not to do that because I felt it was very common to have magic weaken as technology grew. However, now it goes through and evolves along with technology. So essentially, when you start off a new culture, they have very weak magic. And if they learn magic, what happens is they learn new and better techniques, and it improves over time. So much like metallurgy improves over time, so does magic. And it'll really get caught up as I get further into the future, as most magic, as I've said many times on the show, is evolved around essentials. So around farming, around really boring stuff, protecting walls, protecting homes. It's not the typical offensive magic you think of when you think of wizards casting fireballs and magic missiles at people.
Well, and I think, that kind of makes sense, because if magic is based off of mana and the energy of the world, to say like, oh, well, that goes away because we have machinery seems kind of...
Yeah, when it's part of the universe and not a supernatural element in the universe, it doesn't make as much sense for it to simply disappear. Now, in theory, certain cultures might forget how to use it, and very few people in my world have the ability to use it. So that's one fundamental limitation it has. At least themselves directly use it. They might be used as part of a magic ritual, but they're not necessarily magical in and of themselves.
Well, and if magic is designed to make life easier and technology kind of comes in and replaces that, it's much easier to have machinery than learn magic, which is very difficult in your world.
Yes.
So I can kind of see how people would rely less on magic because they have these other ways of doing things.
Yeah. And in a way, it sort of fundamentally retards certain types of development in technology. Certain things where the magic is focused, it takes longer to develop the technology because they're supplementing their ability to do it with magic. So if you can use magic to get better yields of crops from your fields, you focus less on pesticides, you focus less on manure and other forms of fertilizer that help improve the field quality.
So I would imagine, at least from the games that I've played with you, that it would also be the same way with like healing.
Yes.
So the development of healing technology would be slowed down because healing magic is...
Exactly. There are less doctors because there are people who can do things very quickly and much more effectively for an early culture. There gets to points where there are probably dark ages, so to speak, within the development of the, say, magical spell casting. And that's when the other forms catch up a little bit. But in a way, they have an advantage in developing those as well, too, because magic is a fundamental law of the universe. So if you understand it, you kind of understand the properties of it. And so you learn how to extract it in magic, and then you can apply some of that knowledge to say, we know if we take this rock and this rock, we can use it to form iron. We never had to do it by hand before, but now we need more of it. So we need to find a way to do it in the real world. So we have to figure out how to make that correct alloy.
Okay, interesting.
All right. So now let's hop right in here. 8 minutes in, yes. Okay. So the first thing I do typically, and this refers back to this idea that I'm creating a framework world. It's naturalistic in its setting, so it feels kind of like a real world, but it's a framework. So ultimately, you can reutilize, develop deeply into other areas, and continually use the same world to tell stories in. Very common in role-playing games. Some fantasy writers always use the same worlds. Other ones use different worlds every time. So this is much more effective when you want to tell multiple stories in a world. Now, the first thing that I do is I develop the belief systems of culture groups. And so I come up with this thing that I like to call inspiration. So what are the things that inspire me, that kind of go into the development of a culture? And then I try and form what's called a protoculture. And it's a very early culture before technology starts to really evolve and magic along those same terms. And essentially, I look to develop the beliefs, because the beliefs lead into the language, the sounds that are used to represent certain ideas, and they help develop into the religion. So that's where you get the idea of the number 3 is really important in Christianity, because it was really important in Judaism, and it was important in Judaism because of a very early belief, probably before Judaism formally existed.
So I think it's important to kind of note, because I think you kind of jumped in. I think it's important to note that the reason that you're doing this is because you have a story that you want to create right now, whether it's for a game or whether it's for a book, and you are in the time period that you want it to happen in. And so I think where Jeff's going is that you want to look at the races and the cultures that are going to appear in your story and go backwards to make sure that where they are today in your story makes sense.
Yeah. And so the idea is, if I'm like, for my first book that I've been writing, The Steward's Son, the idea is there are 3 predominant cultures that are going to show up relatively quickly in the series. So I need to evolve them all to where they're at the state where they're close together. And so what happens is I need to create protocultures for them. And then I go through this process with each of them, and I layer onto it. But the idea is where I start the evolution is from around the beginning of what's we would on Earth call the Neolithic Period. And that's the period in the development on Earth where agriculture started to pop up in certain places, almost always around rivers first. And there are some very basic cities starting to form in this time. But I'm taking it from this point and I'm evolving it up to the early Iron Age, which is where the story is actually taking place in. And so the idea is, when I first start off, I'm creating this protoculture for each of the cultures. And that's essentially what I just said, where it's the inspirations that inspire them, which could be as complicated as a culture, for like the Bedrachum. The Battle of Brandenburg Forest was a inspiration, which is where the Germans defeated the Romans and took Augustus's eagles. If you've ever seen anything around that time, you'll hear Augustus get incensed with the loss of his eagles, which were the standards on his legion's standards. But then once I have the basics, I move it together. So there's one culture in the area at the beginning called the Syren. The culture grew up in this area, and it kind of spread out in this area. And then 2 waves of mass migrations caused by an empire growing in the rest of the world pushed 2 waves of massive immigration into this part of the world, which kind of created the world the way it is, or the area of the world to the way it is. But the idea is I need to know what the cultures believe basically, and I'm going to iterate through this. So I'm going to go in, once I have the basic beliefs, I'm going to sit there and go, okay, let me come up with some basic ideas for language. Are they an oral tradition? Do they go to writing very quickly? Most cultures will start with an oral language and develop or steal someone else's written language. Very few cultures really developed language out of the blue. A couple did. The Inca, maybe. The Egyptians, and even probably the Chinese, probably the Indians.
The Etruscans.
The Etruscans probably too, yeah.
Because I know that they were going back and they were saying languages. So there's this really cool subscription service called Great Courses. And if you're really into how cultures evolve, like if you want to see this in real life, you should check out this subscription service. You can actually stream it on your TV or on a device. But we were watching the one on the Etruscans, and it actually said that when they went back and looked at the Etruscans, they think that Egyptian was inspired by the Etruscan language.
Oh, so I have
the Romans were. Yeah, it's basically they think that the Etruscan language was actually a mother language that a lot of other languages spread off of.
Okay, I must have fallen asleep for that part of it.
I think you missed that one.
Because in general, the way historians think of it is, like, for the Mediterranean area, what happened is, and possibly this Etruscan thing happened first, but definitely the Egyptian hieroglyphics inspired people to try and write it in simpler ways because it was very complicated to write the hieroglyphics. The Egyptians came up with their own alphabet, but I think that was afterwards. The Phoenicians developed their alphabet based off of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And a lot of the letters we use today are actually, you can actually trace back their forms over time to the actual hieroglyph they came from.
Which they now believe actually came from the Etruscans.
And I do know the Etruscans have definitely influence in Northern Europe for languages. Probably the Norse runes are most closely related to the Etruscan language. I know that one. And maybe even Egyptian came from it, or maybe the alphabetic portion of Egyptian came from it. Not really sure.
Yeah, that's what they think.
Yeah.
But that's a really cool service. Like if you're interested in how to create cultures that evolve, that's a really, like I know the one that we watched on South America.
Yes. The Incan one.
The Incan one was fantastic because it literally took you from the Stone Age to modern day.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of cool to be, and they showed like how when cultures moved, how they changed and absorbed things from other cultures.
Yeah.
So if you want to see like how that happened in reality, that's a really cool way to do it.
And you can go buy individual courses from them too, through Amazon, but it's probably more cost effective if you're like me and consume a lot of the stuff to get the subscription service.
Yeah.
Once I've developed the basic language and religion, or the idea of the religion, probably a few of the primary gods, or if it's monotheistic or not monotheistic, or in the case of my orcs, anti-god. The orcs despise gods in my world because gods are evil trying to destroy the world, and they have to work with the spirits of the world to prevent the gods from taking over. Now, you could argue that they're worshiping the spirits, and maybe the spirits are gods, but not in the minds of the orcs.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, I think doing this kind of work, though, really helps you set in a good foundation.
Yeah.
Because is your culture like a big G God culture?
Yeah.
Or do they have, lots of gods, like, the god of water and the god of land and the,
God of biscuits.
God of biscuits, because we know that's Jeffrey.
That's right.
So I think that kind of puts a good foundation in for what you're trying to design, 1,000 years in the future.
Exactly. So I kind of picked the part of the world I want the cultures to start in, and I have an idea of how I want their beginnings to be, and that's kind of where I place them. If I want them to be a migratory, a bit more of an offensive race, they start off with migration, which leads to early warfare. So the group called the Siren, they lived in what I call the arm of the world, which is part of my world that sort of juts out from the rest of the continent.
You should put a map in
There will be a map in there.
Of course.
And there will be a map showing immigration lines in this one.
Oh,
Yes. Now, what would happen is several thousand years later, with the growth of an empire called the Askuri, the Bedrachum are sort of forced out of their original homeland and start mass migrating through the path of least resistance, which is how migrations happen. You don't go to the toughest spot and fight there. You go away from the toughest spot and you look for weaker spots. You keep moving until you find a place that you want to settle, or you just stay nomadic, one of the two. They end up settling down in the heart of what used to be the Siren lands, and the Siren are still around, but now you have the Bedrachums who are settled in there. And then for a couple hundred years, things start to stabilize a bit. And a third wave of migrations, the orcs come. And there are two different types of cultures that have developed in the orcs at this point. One is plain-driven, one is mountain-driven. And the mountain-driven one actually starts first, but gets up there slower because of the way they're moving through mountains. Yes.
Okay, so I think you need to talk a little bit about how you decided that these things were going to happen. Because you're telling us what happened,
okay,
but how did you determine that the Askuri were going to push, the other culture out of their spot?
Yeah. And the reason was I wanted this super Persian empire in my world, and that was the Askuri. That was what inspired me, was the Persian Empire and their sort of very early growth. Before they were the first real empire in the world that spanned massive amount of square miles, but they did it really before good roads were developed. They didn't really have any of that kind of stuff. They had very light armor. They had good weapons. They had a lot of people, and that's how they did it. So it was this idea of, I'm creating this super Persian empire, which is going to have that same feeling of threat on the rest of the world that it had, that we know that it had on the Greeks, because the Greeks was like, the entire world's invading Greece. And that's what it would have felt like, because this gigantic thing is next to you. So on the cultures that don't collapse or don't get conquered, there's this like threat for a while in my world called the Ascuri. And over time they shatter and disappear. But even in the part of the world I am, they're still a growing threat. So the Bedraken, where they are now, had kind of forgotten about them because they had migrated so long ago. But the threat is starting to become, they're starting to hear about it from their neighbors again, because now their neighbors are worried about the coming Ascuri.
So how do you determine which cultures survive as their own independent entity and which ones are kind of absorbed into another culture?
The way I deal with that is typically nomadic tribes are survivors because they push. People who are tied to cities, who are tied to the land where they live, are going to be absorbed.
Okay.
So, and it doesn't happen exclusively, but almost exclusively when empire takes over a land, it might not create it might not absorb it completely into the culture that took it over, but what remains there will be heavily influenced by this other culture. And that's where you kind of get into this idea of ethnicities, which are really cultures, but they've been influenced by so many different empires. Like you have the Balkans and you have the Croatians, you have the Bosnians, you have all of these different things. But a lot of it's because of so many different cultures invading and controlling that land for such a long time, developed what we consider ethnicities today. But those are really highly developed cultures influenced by a lot of empires. But really, distance and communication is the limiting thing in totally absorbing someone. So the more distance between your main center of culture and them, they're going to be influenced, but they're not going to necessarily be totally absorbed. But now with magic, you can probably much more effectively communicate your culture out to your empire.
So because I think this is really interesting. So if you're looking at a culture 2,000, 3,000 years in the future.
Yeah.
If that culture is still there and predominant, they either had to be nomadic or like a powerhouse.
Or not necessarily powerhouse, but in a spot that just didn't get invaded a lot. Like think of the Inuits. I mean, they maintain probably a lot of their culture, even though they've been conquered, just because of where they live and how they interact. Unlike the other Aboriginal people from North America, their land wasn't heavily sought out to be utilized.
Okay, that's interesting.
So, but in general, yes, it's like where you're strong enough to hold your land, the more of your base culture exists. But as communication grows, as the people's ability to travel and trade grows, you will inevitably be influenced. So only very early on, pre-communication with other cultures, are you truly an independent culture. Once you get to the point where you have other ethnicities bumping up against you, other cultures around you, you will change based off of those. So one of the things to keep in mind here is these are all still protocultures. So the thing is, as I migrate them, tribes, when they splinter apart, I consider them that they will grow into separate cultures. So you have the Bedraken, which separate one tribe sort of goes off into a slightly different direction than the other ones. They become the Umlauten, which are very sort of Norse influenced, and the other ones are very Germanic influenced. Same sort of base culture, but when they sort of restart connecting up in the future, they don't realize that they're even related. They just sort of, oh my God, there are these bad people coming.
Okay, can you, because you've used this term a couple times, but I don't think you've really defined it. What exactly do you mean by protoculture?
A protoculture is a very early sort of pre-technological group of people that has similar beliefs, similar sounds that mean words. So the similar types of gods. So like on Earth, one of the big ones would be the Indo-European culture, which spreads all the way from India all the way up through Europe and mixed in a little bit into other places too. But it's this idea where languages form up and sounds maybe end up meaning different things, but they all come from the same root.
Okay.
And, you might see a thunder god not just in Scandinavia, but in India. And it's from this earlier version of this god that changed over time.
So that'd be similar to seeing the flood story in multiple cultures. Like you see, the story of Noah is in, it's in the Jewish Bible. It's also in the story of Gilgamesh. There's also a story that's very similar in the Incan, in India. There's actually a very similar story. Yeah. So is that kind of the same thing?
Kind of. It depends on, is it from the same oral story? Or sometimes places, a lot of early cultures that sort of stuck around were around rivers, and flooding was a very important part of that. Or, with the El Nino coming in, it would cause massive devastation along the coast. So possibly the same kind of idea there too, because it's typically a drier climate. So you get influxes of massive rains, which would destroy the coastal cities. So to some degree it could be, but not necessarily, because sometimes it's just a shared importance and fear of flooding, or like for the Egyptians, a need for flooding, where their flooding was better. It was timed after their harvest, so they didn't lose food.
Well, this is like an extinction event flood story.
Yeah, of course.
And all of these major cultures.
But think about what happens is, if floods are prevalent, like Egypt didn't have one, but in places where you have more destructive floods, what happens if it's worse next time? Right. I think that's something that you have to worry about for yourself, and maybe come up with your myth to be able to defeat this, because you've done it before, because there's a myth about it. And I think it helps ease fear that in this world you will be wiped out by a flood. But in certain cultural groups, most definitely, it's probably derived from the same story. And in other cultural groups, it's either they hear the story and they appropriate it, or like in the case of the Ingans, they develop their own story.
Okay, cool. Thank you for doing that, because you kept using the term. And
yeah. Now, the idea is, at this point, I have a good protoculture built up. Once I have the protoculture built up, I look at technology and magic. And I sort of evolve where I want those to be in what I call the Bronze Age. So sort of it's where you start getting to basic alloys in the world becoming the predominant tool. This typically causes massive changes in cultures. Bronze is very expensive. It typically helps centralize authority to the aristocracy, because not everyone can afford bronze. So it's a time of the growth of the state. And this is where you really start to see your first kind of empires kind of start to pop up. Cultures start to really abut each other, and a lot of conflict will probably start to follow this. And magic, along the same way, starts to develop to this sort of basic ritualized area where it's not super complicated, but you have like your minor healing spells. You have your minor fertilization spells, or whatever they're called. But you're starting to develop the basic line of learned magic. For people who interact with spirits, they have simple ways of bribing spirits to do good things for them. So once you do that, you sort of have to say, where are my cultures at this point? For your migratory cultures, have they reached the new area yet? And what are the experiences they've learned? Has anything major happened at this point? And when you do that, you sort of go back to the beliefs and say, this belief is going to shift into, belief A is now belief B. Maybe before they thought the number 2 was important, but now the number 3 is important because maybe they use 3 types of metal to make their swords. And so that becomes a more important number. So certain things are going to kind of evolve mostly naturally from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age. And so you sort of look at what are the new experiences, and if you come up with names at this point, start tracking them down, because at some point, you might want to refer back to them later. So you start getting the basic idea of historical characters for your setting. But you go through and you go through the culture, you develop the language a bit more, and you develop the religion a lot more. because religion typically is very important, and most early states are typically theocratic in nature, where either there's a god king or a group of priests. And usually the reason the empires are starting to spread at the earliest is to spread the religion, because enough of the people believe in the religion now, they're trying to get the people around them to do the correct religion. And that will create a lot of the early conflicts, a lot of the early rivalries in different cultures.
Well, I'd imagine too that resources would also cause a lot of conflict.
Well, it's so funny how ultimately, if you get to go to the root of most conflicts, outside of just a religious or a national security threat, there's almost always an economic component. And the farther back you go, the more truth there is to that. But the thing is, you use the religious context because people believe in the religion and they're either afraid of their gods or they're afraid of their afterlife. And you can use that to easily get them to commit war on another city-state or another country because they're trying to support, their religion, even though you're trying to take that city-state because it has a copper mine.
Right.
Yeah. Or more importantly, food because there was a flood.
Mm-hmm. So then it seems like, you're just kind of like rinsing and repeating this process as you're going through to where you want your story to take place.
Yeah, because really it's a two-step process every time. And then you sit there or really a three-step, because you do the basic beliefs, then you come up with the language and religion, then you look to where you want your technology and magic to go. And then you say, okay, now I have that. What are the changes in the experiences? And the big thing to keep in mind is if you have a protoculture that spreads all over the world, if they don't have the ability to communicate with each other, the shared beliefs are going to change based off of where they live at this point. So if, like in the case of the orcs, basically half the orcs get trapped on one side of the asteroid, half the orcs get trapped on the other side, their cultures become radically different over time. And in the future, they could not even communicate with each other, not even close, even though they have the same root language. It's just the way things go.
Okay, so a couple questions. So how do you keep track of all this stuff? Because it seems to me that as you're developing like one culture, you have to start documenting all of the cultures that they're bumping into to make sure that you've got consistency when you write those cultures.
Exactly. And I don't always do that. I do track the cultures I know that are there. And sometimes, like later on, I add a cultural group into a spot. And that wasn't thought of when they first come through. So one of the thoughts is, okay, they had this major experience from this time to this time because there was a mass military migration through their lands. And it didn't stay and occupy their lands, but it would have had a huge impact on whatever culture was there at the time. Normally, the cultures that I know that are there, and I usually have a few different protocultures that I work with from the very beginning. I have, for my world, one based off of the goblins, one based off of the elves, one based off of the orcs, and a couple based off of the humans. Actually, several based off of the humans. And actually, dwarfs don't even exist. It's halflings is my main culture. They split in half, and half become dwarfs, half become gnomes. And then there's this group called halflings, which are the parent race.
Yay, gnomes.
Yay, gnomes.
But like, how do you keep track of all this?
So essentially, it's like I will have a track, like a Word document for a protoculture. Mm-hmm. And then I'll use that as a starting point for whenever I create a new culture based off of that group. And then whenever I do the group, I just have one document where I add stuff in. I'll put in the names and places. I'll create notes of those with 3 descriptors, typically, saying, the elf culture, is based on sort of Sanskrit style language, script language, nature, especially trees, and long life. Those are the 3 things that define elf culture. So I kind of have that off to the side. And then I know it's going to break up over time too. And sometimes I'll break it up as I move along, but I just keep track of that in the protoculture. And then I have that to work off of to grow that into new cultures later on.
So like, would you have a separate Word document for the Escari and a separate one for the Bedrakans?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I end up with every major culture group that I develop, I have a document for.
Okay. And you're updating each of those so if you're working on No,
I'll work through one at a time. I iterate to where it needs to be. I'll put notes for its contacts with the other one in that document, but I won't fill in the details.
Okay.
I just know that there was a conflict.
Right. Okay.
So
then when you go, because I'm like, this process to me seems like incredibly daunting.
It's actually, it's simple because a lot of it is you're just going through. So I could develop a culture in an afternoon.
Well, I'm more concerned about making sure that there's consistency throughout all of them.
Sure. But that's why you're sort of documenting the names down at the time, and then you're just distribute them out. So that's all there really is to it, because the thing is, unless they're very closely knit to each other, there's not a lot of consistency concerns.
Mm-hmm.
So the Ascari, very early in their development, are when they have the contact with the Bedrakam. So the Bedrakam development, most of that is away from them.
Right.
It's fleeing these sand people, which end up becoming the boogeyman. The sand people are the evil people in Bedrakam mythology.
Okay.
But they're not even humans in Bedrakam mythology.
So Word documents, lots of Word documents.
Well, Scrivener typically, but essentially.
Okay. Because I would think Scrivener would probably be easier, because then you can kind of see everything in one place.
And you can find the other documents a lot more easily when they're connected in Scrivener. So it's like I'll have an area for cultures, a folder, and then a document for each culture underneath there. And some will be proto and some will not be proto. Or like in the case of the Bedrakam, that is the proto culture and a culture later on. So I know that one culture derives off of them directly, and there's some ethnicities, but I don't worry so much about that. I write them down if I need to later on. I know where they're at, but not necessarily the differences always.
Okay.
I develop those as needed. So, it's like you have a lot lighter development early on, and the more distant you are from your story, but you just need a thread to connect it to the future. And then if you go back into the past, you can add in stuff. And you can develop more over time if you want to, but you don't necessarily need all of it. You just need those threads that come through history, because a lot of times history is a lie. People's beliefs and memories of what happened aren't necessarily what happened. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, is if it's perfectly consistent, throughout itself, it's wrong. Because, the Bedrakam of the Iron Age are maybe kind of close to what happened in the Bronze Age, but they're definitely way off in what happened in the Stone Age.
Well, it's almost like, we were watching, was it Shannara last night? We started watching that. And, what's happening in the story, most people don't believe it because it happened such a long time ago that it became legend.
Yeah.
And so it was no longer history, and so that's another piece that can kind of factor into your story, is that historical events sometimes just become legend.
Yeah. And sometimes they're reported even falsely. It's like, this is the great battle we won, which defined our country. But what you don't realize, if you go back 3,000 years in the past to when that battle happened, you were actually invading that country, got your butt kicked, but enough that they didn't reinvade you back. So you sort of developed this long-term stalemate with the country. But in your mind, you won. Probably in their mind, they won. Survivors typically win.
Huzzah,
Yes.
we're alive, yay. Okay. And then the other question I have is that when you're doing this for like multiple cultures in your story, is there a certain order that you should do this in? So like the most prominent culture in the story, do you do them first, or the largest culture in the story? How do you decide?
The one that's central to the story.
Okay.
So for the Stewart's son, the Bedrakam culture was done first. Even though if I was truly developing it correctly, I would have done the Siren first, because they were in that part of the world first. And the Bedrakam came later. But the thing is, where the story takes place at the time, it's Bedrakam controlled. So to me, that was the most important one to know first. And then I could fill in the Siren. I could fill in the mountain orcs that are in the area as needed. And then there's some plains orcs down a little further south too, which aren't quite as predominant in the story. But I have the basics for all of them where I know enough. I can talk about them. I know some battles that took place between peoples and stuff like that. But the main thing is you need to know the most about the area you're telling the story in. And then a ring around that, you know, the second most about. And then further out, you might have just those like couple bullet points about, okay, here's the Escry. I know these things about them. Here are the Mysteritos. They used to be in the area, but they're no longer. But here's a few things about them. So the further away you go, the less you know. But I always like to have like 3 things at least I know about something, so I can have consistency whenever they pop up in a different culture.
Yeah, because I think that's so important, because I can't tell you how many books I've read, and even within the context of one book, it's not consistent.
Once again, it depends what you mean by consistency, because I always look naturally there's hypocrisy in things. There are flaws in the way people think at times. And that pops up in culture because it's made up of people. So sometimes inconsistencies are perfectly legitimate. If you take any culture on Earth, no one's 100% logical all the time. The Vulcans weren't 100% logical all the time. So there will be inconsistencies naturally. And that's where the beauty of culture is, you know, the way it develops sometimes doesn't quite make sense to what really happened, but it happened, and that's what caused it.
Well, it's sometimes you read a story and, you know, you're given kind of like the set of rules for the people, and then you have somebody do something that is so uncharacteristic for that culture.
Yep.
And it's never explained.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like plopped in there.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and that's when you're reading a story and you're like, wait, that doesn't, and you kind of like almost like lose faith in the story at that point, because
well, that's one of the things
it's not intent. It's like, it wasn't like intentionally placed there as like, this person's like a misfit or an outcast or whatever. So I think it's just really important to do what you're talking about.
And that's actually one thing I do when I create a character of a culture is I know what the cultural ideals are. I know what the cultural reality is, because reality of where your culture is and what your cultural ideas should never match. And then I have characters who maybe get closer to the cultural idea. Those are your heroes. Those are your good guys. And people who get further away from the cultural evils and or cultural norms, the further they get away, the more they become bad guys. And you know, you can even reverse what it is. If murder is perfectly acceptable in the culture, if they murder the most people, they are the good, best people in the culture. I don't have cultures like that. I have some where certain kinds of killing aren't necessarily bad, but just outright murder, by their definition, it's pretty much usually always bad in most cultures, because cultures that kill culturally don't really survive.
Well, those aren't murders. Those are sacrifices, and
they're sacrifices, or
there's a purpose to the killing.
There's a purpose to the killing. That's right. But outright murder would be wrong.
Exactly. It's murder with purpose.
Murder with purpose. That's right. As long as the culture can appropriate the murder for the good of all, then it's a good. And if it's for one person, typically it's bad. Mm-hmm. But yeah. But I do actually keep that in mind when I create my characters of the culture, is how closely are they aligned to the cultural ideals. And if there are 3 major cultural ideals, maybe there are 2 they're close to, but 1 that they're off. So it allows characters to vary, but stay culturally appropriate. You know, subcultures are things that are where the idea of a subculture. So let's say like you're emo. Your subculture is different than American culture or Western culture based off of emo-iness.
Emo-iness?
Emo-iness. I don't really know enough about emos to say that, but
okay.
I know you have to shop at Hot Topic and stuff like that.
You've been watching too much South Park.
Right. But that is really it.
Okay. And I think, you know, one thing that I don't think you mentioned was that make sure that your naming is consistent.
Yeah. That's one thing I kind of do at the end. I go through and sometimes I spell things slightly differently, especially as I do have a separate language file from my culture file. I like to keep those separate because a language file can get really large. But I want to make sure that the names are consistent with the culture, and those will evolve over time as well too. But you don't have to worry so much about that unless you want to.
Okay. That was really interesting.
Yep.
It was much more interesting than I thought it was going to be. I have to say.
Hey, you watch all those other documentaries with me, so
yeah, I know.
You do this whether or not you know you do.
Okay, so is there a world building task of the day?
Yeah, the world building task of the day is to, if you have a work in progress and a world that you've used that you want to reuse, sort of look at your cultures and to determine, do you have a proto culture, depending on where you're at in the timeline evolution of your world, or create a proto culture for the cultures that you're using and then work back to it, or take a new world and just create a proto culture and apply it into different geographies and figure out what it would look like in different geographies.
Okay. And what's the real world task of the day?
The real world task for the day is to start getting a website put together for your book selling, a way for you to communicate with your audience. And really it's to bootstrap it. And it kind of works out because this Wednesday at 7:30,
yep,
which will be August
31st.
31st, I think. Let me look real quick.
Yeah, I think it's 31st.
So the thing that you should do this week in the real world is start making sure that you have a core area that you can communicate to fans. So you can start growing a fan base. So if you start selling modules or you start selling books, you have a way to start communicating with people who are potential fans.
And what's actually really cool is this week, this Wednesday at 7:30, we are actually doing a webinar on bootstrapping.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I forgot.
And so bootstrapping is when you don't have a lot of money to start, your project. And so we're going to talk about a lot of low-cost tools and free tools that you can use to start building your platform. So, you can build that audience. So when you release your modules, your books, your games, you've got a built-in audience for that.
Yeah. Because even if you're going through like the platform through Wizards of the Coast to sell D&D modules, you have to get people to your modules to buy them. If you have a book, even if you're being published by someone, they're going to expect you to do the marketing. So you need to start building connections with either people, or if you just want to play with friends, give them a place to go check out your world and maybe inspire other people who are world builders out there or who are game masters.
Well, and if you're trying to get traditionally published, if you don't have an audience,
you're probably not going to be traditionally published.
Right. No matter how good your story is.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a really good point.
And even if you have money and that you could kind of throw at it to get started, my advice is don't do that. Because one, you're probably going to duplicate and buy tools you don't need or know how to use. Start off with what you need and learn enough about it so when you get a little bit better tool that you know how to deal with that in case the tool no longer is available or the person you hired to do something for you is no longer available. You need to kind of know all of the elements of the business side or the outreach side of being a creator so that later on you can improve it, but you're not just throwing money and wasting it at it. So check us out. If you're seeing this before August 31st, 2016 at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. Come check us out. And we'll see you there.
So the website for that is smallbizlife.com/webinar, or you can go to the show notes at gardul.com for episode 137.
And one last note, whenever you give people something, to do where they need to go somewhere, it's probably best you actually mention the name.
Yeah. Have a great week.
And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us in this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes And please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Garduel.com to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.